The year was 1944. While Europe was engulfed in flames, Nazi Germany held most of the continent in its iron grip. France was occupied, Poland was crushed, and Greece, along with its islands, groaned under the weight of German boots. Everyone was afraid. Everyone was cowering. Everyone believed the Germans were invincible. But in the middle of the Mediterranean, on the island of Crete, a handful of British officers were busy planning the impossible. Their plan was so insane, so unbelievable, that everyone who heard it would laugh and call it madness, because these men were planning to kidnap one of the highest-ranking generals of the Nazi army from an island guarded by thousands of German soldiers, using the general's own car. Sounds absolutely ridiculous and crazy, right? And you know what? They actually pulled it off. But how? That's exactly what we're going to tell you in this story. Now hit that subscribe button and like the video, then let's get started. The island of Crete had been under German occupation since 1941. To capture this island, the Germans had carried out the largest airborne operation in history. Thousands of German paratroopers had landed on the island, and bloody clashes with British and Greek forces had ensued. In the end, the Germans won, but this victory came at a heavy cost. They had suffered so many casualties that Adolf Hitler decided never to conduct another large-scale airborne operation again. Crete was both a victory and a scar for Nazi pride, two things at once. Life under occupation had become a nightmare for the people of Crete. The Germans were ruthless. At the slightest suspicion of resistance, villages were burned and civilians were executed. But the Cretans didn't give up. Resistance groups formed in the mountains, and alongside these resistance groups were British agents who had secretly infiltrated the island. The British Special Operations Executive, the SOE, was conducting covert operations against Nazi occupation in every corner of Europe. Crete was one of the most critical points of these operations. This is where the heroes of our story enter the stage. Patrick Leigh Fermor. Remember that name, because this man was no ordinary soldier. Fermor was one of the most extraordinary individuals Britain ever produced. At a young age, he dropped out of school and walked across Europe. He walked from Germany to Turkey, learned dozens of languages, and absorbed different cultures. A fascinating character. He spoke Greek so well that Greek villagers thought he was a local. When the war started, these skills made him a perfect candidate for intelligence work. The SOE recruited him and sent him to Crete. Fermor had been operating in Crete since 1942. He had passed through checkpoints wearing German uniforms. He had lived with Cretan resistance fighters in the mountains. He had slept in caves on cold winter nights. He had planned operations right under the Germans' noses. This man either didn't know what fear was, or if he did, he simply didn't care. And now, in early 1944, he had a crazy plan in his mind. Could you ever be this brave? Anyway, let's continue. The plan was this: kidnap General Friedrich Wilhelm Müller, the commander of German forces in Crete. Müller was a ruthless man known as the Butcher of Crete. He had ordered the burning of dozens of villages and the execution of hundreds of civilians. Kidnapping him would be both a military blow and a psychological victory. The Germans would realize that even their highest-ranking commanders weren't safe. It would reignite the spirit of resistance, and it would show the world that the British continued to defy Nazi Germany. SOE headquarters in London approved this plan, but while preparations for the operation were underway, something unexpected happened. General Müller left Crete and was replaced by a new commander, General Heinrich Kreipe. Kreipe didn't have a reputation as brutal as Müller's, but he was still an experienced Nazi general. He had fought on the Eastern Front against the Soviets. He was an Iron Cross recipient, and now he was the new ruler of Crete. The plan didn't change, only the target had changed. Now Kreipe would be kidnapped. He was the new victim. Let's pause here for a moment. To fully grasp just how insane this operation was, I need to tell you about the situation in Crete. There were approximately 30,000 German soldiers on the island. 30,000! There were checkpoints, patrol units, and watchtowers everywhere. German intelligence was looking under every rock. They had placed bounties on resistance members. Informants roamed every village, and under these conditions, a handful of men were planning to kidnap a Nazi general. Sounds impossible, right? They were going to pull him out of his car, transport him from one end of the island to the other, and then escape to Egypt by submarine. That's what makes this story so extraordinary. Alongside Fermor was a second hero, William Stanley Moss, or Billy Moss as everyone knew him. Moss was younger than Fermor, but just as courageous. He had served as an officer in the Coldstream Guards before joining the SOE. He was handsome, charismatic, and a bit of a ladies' man. After the war, he would tell the story of this operation in a book called Ill Met by Moonlight, which would become a worldwide bestseller. But now, in February 1944, Moss was simply a young officer focused on the mission. Fermor and Moss met in Cairo. They worked on the plan for days. They evaluated every detail, every possibility, every risk. Maps were studied, intelligence reports were read, encrypted messages were exchanged with the resistance network in Crete, and finally, every step of the operation was planned. The plan was as follows. First, they would secretly land in Crete. They would approach the island's southern coast by submarine, then go ashore in rubber dinghies. Then they would cross the mountains to the north of the island, to the Heraklion region where the general's headquarters was located. There, they would meet with Cretan resistance fighters and learn the general's daily routine. Every evening, Kreipe drove from his headquarters to his villa in the village of Archanes. This was exactly where they would set up the ambush. But there was a problem. Kreipe's car always had an armed driver and a bodyguard with him. Additionally, there were German checkpoints along the road. How would it be possible to stop the general's car, kidnap him, and then pass through German lines? This is where Fermor's genius came into play. Fermor obtained German uniforms. He and Moss would disguise themselves as German military police. They would stop the general's car on the road, pretending it was a traffic check. When the car stopped, they would neutralize the driver, capture the general, and escape by driving the car. Then, pay attention because this is very important, they would pass through German checkpoints in the general's own car, but now holding the general hostage. The Germans would recognize their own general's car and wave it through with a salute. Madness! Absolutely! But could it work? We'll see. What do you think? In late March 1944, Fermor and Moss set out from Egypt along with 2 other British soldiers. The submarine dropped them off on the southern coast of Crete. On a dark night, they went ashore in rubber dinghies. The moment their feet touched Cretan soil, there was no turning back. Now they were in enemy territory. If they were caught, the best-case scenario was becoming prisoners of war. The worst case, they would be executed by firing squad as spies. Nazi Germany showed absolutely no mercy to enemy agents. After landing, they climbed into the mountains. The mountains of Crete were steep and unforgiving. Cold nights, rocky trails, thorny bushes, but Fermor knew this terrain like the back of his hand. He had lived here for 2 years. He knew which villages he could trust, which shepherds supported the resistance, and which paths were safe. Within a few days, they met with Cretan resistance fighters. These men were brave villagers who lived in the mountains and fought against the German occupation. Most of them defied the German army with nothing but old rifles in their hands. Fermor had great respect for their heroism, and they trusted Fermor because he was a Briton who kept his word. He had lived with them in the mountains. He had shared their suffering. He had never abandoned them halfway. If you're enjoying this, don't forget to subscribe and like. The intelligence from the resistance fighters was worth its weight in gold. General Kreipe's routine had been identified. He left his headquarters every evening at 7 o'clock. He drove to the village of Archanes. There was a certain junction along the road where it passed through a narrow curve. The car had to slow down. This was exactly where the ambush would be set. The team began preparations. The German uniforms were checked one last time. Weapons were cleaned. Each man's role was assigned once more. Fermor and Moss would pose as German police on the road. The others would hide in the darkness and act when the signal came. Everything was planned down to the second. A single mistake could mean the end for all of them. And then they began to wait. The date was set for the evening of April 26, 1944. That night the moonlight was sufficient but not too bright. Visibility was ideal for both the ambushers and the approaching car. Everything was ready. It was past 6 o'clock. Fermor and Moss took their positions by the roadside. Their German military police uniforms looked perfect. They had flashlights in their hands, just like a real traffic checkpoint. Their hearts were pounding, but nothing showed on their faces. Years later, when Fermor recalled this moment, he would say, "Those were the longest minutes of my life." The sound of an engine came from the distance. Headlights pierced the darkness. A car was approaching. But was this the general's car, or just an ordinary German military vehicle? If they stopped the wrong car, everything would be ruined. An alarm would be raised, reinforcements would be called to the area, and the operation would be over before it even started. As the car approached, Fermor looked at the license plate. This was it, the general's official staff car, a large black limousine. The German army pennant was flying on the front windshield. The silhouette in the back seat was barely visible. General Heinrich Kreipe, completely unaware, was approaching his death or his captivity. Fermor raised his hand. He waved his flashlight, the universal signal, stop. And the car began to slow down. Now, right at the most exciting part, hit that subscribe button. We're moving on to part 2. Welcome back to part 2, dear viewers. We're continuing our story without stopping, right where we left off. I know you're curious. I'm curious too. So let's continue. The car stopped. The engine was still running, the headlights illuminating the road. The driver rolled down the window and said something in German. Fermor approached the car with calm steps. His heart was pounding wildly, but his face was ice cold. Years of agent training and field experience had prepared him for this moment. His German was flawless. His posture, his gaze, everything resembled a German military policeman. The driver suspected nothing. When Fermor reached the side of the car, everything happened in an instant. Billy Moss approached from the other side. The Cretan resistance fighters, hidden in the darkness, sprang into action. Fermor suddenly opened the driver's door and pulled the man out. At the same moment, Moss opened the rear door and lunged at the general. Before Kreipe could understand what was happening, his hands were cuffed and his mouth was gagged. The entire operation took less than 15 seconds. 15 seconds! Even the world's best-trained special forces would envy this speed. Well, that's exactly how it had to be. The driver was neutralized and left by the roadside. He wasn't dead, just unconscious. Fermor and his team avoided unnecessary bloodshed. This wasn't a revenge operation. The goal was to kidnap the general safely and show the world British courage. Killing the driver would gain them nothing, but leaving him alive proved how professional and humane this operation was. The British weren't like the Nazis. They followed the rules of war. General Kreipe was shoved into the back seat of the car. 2 Cretan resistance fighters sat beside him. The men pressed their weapons against the general's ribs. Kreipe didn't dare move. He still couldn't fully grasp what had just happened. A few minutes ago, he was a powerful Nazi general driving from his headquarters to his villa. Now he was a hostage, in the backseat of his own car, in the hands of his enemies, a prisoner whose fate was completely uncertain. And now the most dangerous part of the operation was beginning, passing through German checkpoints with the car. This too was an extremely difficult operation. The operation was still ongoing. It wasn't over yet. Fermor sat behind the wheel. He put the general's cap on his head. In the darkness, when viewed from inside the car, he now looked like the general. Moss sat in the passenger seat. The engine was running. The headlights lit up the road, and the car began to move. The first checkpoint was only a few kilometers ahead. Fermor pressed the gas, but was careful not to go too fast. They were moving at a normal speed, like a normal vehicle. The general's official staff car was recognizable. German soldiers saw this car every day. They shouldn't have any suspicions. As they approached the checkpoint, Fermor flashed the headlights on and off. This was a signal meaning priority passage. High-ranking officers' vehicles used this signal and were usually let through without being stopped. The German sentry saw the car, recognized the pennant, and immediately raised the barrier. He gave his salute. The car passed without slowing down. One checkpoint down, but there were still 21 more to go. At this point, we've reached the middle of the video, and I want to ask you something. Is this story surprising you? If so, please like this video because we work very hard to bring you this kind of content. We put in a lot of effort, and we want to continue making these videos and telling these stories with your support. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, subscribe because this story is just getting started, and the ending is incredible. Now let's continue. The car was passing through the city of Heraklion. The streets were full of German soldiers. Patrol units were walking about. Military vehicles were passing by. And right in the middle of them, a car carrying a kidnapped Nazi general was moving along. Fermor's hands were sweating on the steering wheel, but his voice didn't tremble. Moss sat quietly beside him. In the back seat, Kreipe sat motionless with his mouth gagged. If he made a sound or a movement, everything could be over. They reached the second checkpoint. This time, the sentry was a bit more attentive. He approached the car. Fermor rolled down the window slightly and muttered something in German. He mentioned the general's name. The sentry gave his salute and opened the barrier. The car passed. Third checkpoint. Fourth. Fifth. The same scenario repeated at each one. Fermor never lost his composure. He passed through checkpoints as if it were something he did every day. When Moss later described these moments, he would say, "Patrick's courage was superhuman. I was sweating. My heart was pounding like it was going to stop, but he was calm, as if he were on a Sunday drive." But the danger wasn't only at the checkpoints. Inside the city, German soldiers were walking on the road. Some of them looked at the car. If they looked inside carefully, they might notice something was wrong in the back seat. But the darkness was their friend. The night was the greatest ally of this crazy operation. They passed through Heraklion. Now they were outside the city, but the checkpoints continued. Every few kilometers there was a new barrier, a new sentry, a new risk. Fermor was getting tired, but stopping wasn't an option. Every passing minute increased the chances of the Germans finding the driver. If the driver woke up and raised the alarm, the entire island would go on alert. At the 11th checkpoint, something unexpected happened. The sentry stopped the car and wanted to look inside. Fermor's blood ran cold. If the man looked in the back seat, he would see that the general's mouth was gagged. Everything would be over. But Fermor thought fast. In a stern voice, he told the sentry, "The general is very tired. Do not disturb him." He had perfectly imitated the manner of a high-ranking German officer. The sentry hesitated. He thought for a moment. Then he gave his salute and opened the barrier. The car passed. Fermor would later say he never felt closer to death than in that moment. Those few seconds were the longest moments of his life. Toward midnight, they passed the 22nd and final checkpoint. Now they were far outside the city. The road curved toward the mountains, and here, at a predetermined point, they would abandon the car. The car stopped at the beginning of a trail. Fermor and Moss got out. They pulled the general out of the car. Kreipe now fully understood the seriousness of his situation. He had been kidnapped. He was in enemy territory, in enemy hands, and now they were taking him into the mountains, into the unknown. But Fermor and Moss were professionals. They didn't mistreat the general. They treated him as a prisoner of war, as required by the Geneva Convention. This was something Nazi Germany never did. The Germans tortured and killed enemy agents. But the British were different. They were representatives of a civilized nation, and they demonstrated this at every stage of the operation. Before leaving the car, Fermor did something very clever. He left a letter inside the car. The letter was written in German and said, "General Kreipe has been taken prisoner by British forces. This operation was carried out entirely by British military personnel. No Cretan civilians participated in this operation. Any reprisals against the Cretan people will be considered a war crime." This letter was vitally important because they knew what the Germans would do. If they thought Cretans had played a role in the operation, they would burn villages and massacre civilians in retaliation. They had done it many times before. Fermor was trying to protect his Cretan friends with this letter. This showed what a thoughtful and strategic leader he was. He wasn't just thinking about the operation, he was calculating the consequences of the operation, its potential side effects. The car was left there. Now it was time to walk, and this walk would perhaps be the most difficult part of the operation. The mountains of Crete were merciless: steep cliffs, deep valleys, thorny bushes, cold nights, and they would have to traverse all of this with a reluctant Nazi general. Kreipe was overweight and completely out of shape. He was practically incapable of walking. The physical condition of a general who commanded wars from behind a desk was not at all suitable for mountain hiking. But there was no choice. Everyone had to walk. The first night's march began. Fermor led the way, navigating with his compass and memory. Moss followed close behind the general. Cretan resistance fighters provided security around them. Silently, in the darkness, they advanced through enemy territory. Kreipe complained. His feet hurt. He was out of breath. He wanted to rest, but Fermor was relentless. To stop meant death. The Germans would begin searching for the general at dawn. The farther they got, the better. And indeed, the next morning, all hell broke loose. When the Germans found the driver and read the letter inside the car, they understood what had happened. Their general had been kidnapped. This was one of the greatest humiliations experienced during the Nazi occupation. Hitler was furious. The German command in Crete went on full alert. Thousands of soldiers were mobilized. Aircraft took off. Villages were searched. Every stone was looked under. Bounties were posted. A large cash reward would be given to whoever brought the general back. Informants were promised amnesty. The entire island had become a hunting ground. But Fermor and his team had already gone deep into the mountains. Cretan resistance fighters were moving them from cave to cave, from village to village. German patrols passed very close to them several times. Once, while Fermor and his group hid in the bushes, German soldiers passed just a few meters away. They held their breath. They didn't move. And the Germans passed by without noticing them. Luck was on their side that time. Something incredible happened during this escape. One night, as General Kreipe and Patrick Leigh Fermor sat side by side, the general looked up at the snow-covered Mount Ida, and suddenly he began reciting a poem in Latin. It was a passage from the Roman poet Horace, an ancient poem describing the majesty of mountains. Fermor was surprised, but then he recited the continuation of the same poem. Two enemies, a Nazi general and a British agent, in the middle of the Cretan mountains, in the moonlight, sharing classical Latin poetry. This moment was a brief glimpse of humanity amidst the madness of war. When Fermor later recounted this moment, he would say, "In that moment, I remembered that he, too, had once been just a human being. War had turned all of us into monsters. But that night, for a moment, we sat simply as two men. This story shows that this operation was not just a military victory. It was also proof that the human spirit, even in the darkest times, could preserve its humanity. Fermor didn't have to hate his enemy. He could treat him like a human being, and he did. Days passed. The escape continued. The team moved from mountain to mountain, from valley to valley. Food was scarce. Finding water was difficult. Everyone was exhausted, but no one gave up. The Cretan resistance fighters found a new shelter every night. Villagers shared their last bread with them. This wasn't just a military operation. This was the resistance of an entire people. Kreipe changed during this time. At first he was arrogant and sullen, but as the days passed, the humane treatment he was shown affected him. Fermor and his team didn't mistreat him. They shared their food. When he was injured, they bandaged him, and the general slowly began to respect these men. Once, Kreipe said to Fermor, "If German soldiers were in your place, they would have killed me by now." Fermor smiled. "We're not German," he said. "We're British." This sentence summarized the spirit of the entire operation. The British wanted to win the war, but they wanted to win while preserving their honor. They would not respond to the brutality of Nazi Germany with the same brutality. While defending civilization, they would manage to remain civilized. Finally, after 18 days of escape, they reached the southern coast of Crete, Perinoia Beach. A British submarine was waiting for them there. In the darkness of night, they descended to the shore. The sea was black and silent. In the distance, a light flashed on and off. The signal was coming from the submarine. Rubber dinghies approached the shore. Fermor, Moss, Kreipe, and the entire team boarded the boats. The oars dipped into the water, and slowly they moved away from Crete. Behind them was the occupied island. Ahead of them was freedom. When General Kreipe boarded the submarine, he was a different man. Compared to the night he was kidnapped, he was thinner, more tired, but perhaps more humane. For 18 days he had lived with his enemies, and he had learned that they were not monsters, but honorable warriors. The submarine dove and headed toward Egypt. The operation had been successfully completed. What was called impossible had been achieved. A handful of brave Britons and their Cretan friends had kidnapped a general from the heart of Nazi Germany. They had passed through 22 checkpoints. They had evaded thousands of German soldiers for 18 days, and they had accomplished this without a single casualty. This operation was written into one of the most brilliant pages of military history. It became proof of how powerful courage, intelligence, and determination could be, and it showed the world that the British spirit could never be broken. But the story doesn't end here. What happened to General Kreipe? What did Fermor and Moss do after the war? And what is the true legacy of this operation? I'll tell you all of this in the final part. If you're curious about what happens next, subscribe. As the submarine moved through the dark waters of the Mediterranean, the passengers inside sat in deep silence. Patrick Leigh Fermor was exhausted from fatigue, but a light of victory shone in his eyes. Billy Moss sat on the deck, replaying the events in his mind over and over again. And General Heinrich Kreipe was no longer a Nazi general. He was a prisoner of war. 18 days ago, he was the ruler of Crete. Now he was traveling through the narrow corridors of an enemy submarine, heading toward an uncertain future. When the submarine reached Egypt, British headquarters in Cairo was in a state of jubilation. The news spread like wildfire. The British had kidnapped a general from the heart of Nazi Germany. This was an incredible achievement that boosted the morale of Allied forces during the darkest days of the war. Even Winston Churchill spoke highly of this operation. The British press carried the story in headlines. Fermor and Moss became heroes overnight. But they weren't the only true heroes. The resistance fighters who stayed in Crete, the villagers, the shepherds, they were all the invisible heroes of this operation. The women who shared their last bread, the elderly who misdirected German patrols, the children who showed the way through the mountains. This operation was not just the victory of a few British officers, it was the victory of an entire people, and this should never be forgotten. General Kreipe was sent from Cairo to England. There he was held with other high-ranking German prisoners of war. He remained a prisoner throughout the war and was treated as required by the Geneva Convention. No torture, no humiliation, no revenge. The British understood the importance of treating even their enemies humanely. This was the fundamental difference that separated them from the Nazis. When the war ended in 1945, Kreipe was released and returned to Germany. But here's what's interesting. Kreipe maintained contact with Fermor and Moss after the war. Yes, you heard that right. The kidnapper and the kidnapped corresponded through letters years later. They even met face-to-face in 1972 on a Greek television program. Can you imagine? Two sides for whom it had once been a matter of life and death, sitting and chatting years later like old friends. During this meeting, Kreipe made an interesting confession to Fermor. "That night when your car stopped me," Kreipe said, "my first thought was that you were partisans. If that had been the case, I would have died there that night. But you British took me as a prisoner of war. I owe you my life." These words were the strongest proof of how professionally and humanely the operation had been conducted. Fermor smiled and replied to Kreipe, "War makes people enemies, but when war ends, so should enmity. We read Horace together in those mountains. In that moment, we were just two human beings." These words perfectly summarized Fermor's character. He wasn't just a brave warrior, he was also a thoughtful, educated, and deeply humane man. What did Patrick Leigh Fermor do after the war? That's a story in itself. Fermor became known for much more than his war heroism. He became one of the greatest travel writers of the 20th century. The books describing his walk across Europe in his youth became world classics. His works A Time of Gifts and Between the Woods and the Water are considered masterpieces of English literature. Fermor wielded words as skillfully as he wielded a sword. In love with Greece, Fermor settled in the country after the war. He had a stone house built by the sea on the Mani Peninsula. There he wrote, read, swam, and hosted old friends. The Greek people never forgot him. He is still remembered as a hero in Crete. Every year, memorial ceremonies are held on the anniversary of the operation. Fermor passed away in 2011 at the age of 96. It was a long, full, and extraordinary life. Billy Moss also lived a remarkable life after the war. He wrote the book Ill Met by Moonlight about the operation, and it became an international success. In 1957, the book was adapted into a film of the same name. The film, in which Dirk Bogarde played Patrick Leigh Fermor, became a classic. Moss continued working as a writer and journalist. He passed away in 1965 at just 44 years old. He had lived a short but intense life. So what is the true legacy of this operation? Why is this story still being told today? Why is it so important? First of all, from a military standpoint, this operation was a masterpiece. Minimum resources, maximum impact. A few men, a few weapons, plenty of courage and intelligence. At the height of Nazi Germany's power, they proved that the Germans were not invincible. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a psychological blow. The Germans realized that even their highest-ranking commanders weren't safe. This fear spread across all of occupied Europe. Resistance fighters found courage, collaborators hesitated, and the course of the war began to be shaped by these small but powerful strikes. Second, this operation displayed the best qualities of British character: courage, intelligence, humor, composure, and honor. Fermor and Moss could crack jokes even in the most dangerous moments. They could treat their enemies humanely. They didn't lose their humanity while winning the war. This was something very rare at the time. Nazi Germany ruled through brutality, but the British managed to remain civilized while defending civilization. Third, this story showed the power of friendship and loyalty. The bond between Fermor and the Cretan resistance fighters continued long after the war. Fermor considered Crete his second homeland. The Cretans never forgot him. This was a true friendship that blossomed amidst the destruction of war, and this friendship was one of the cornerstones of the operation's success. Fermor couldn't have done this alone, but with the help of the Cretans, he made the impossible possible. This operation also had a great impact on American allies. The United States was Britain's closest ally. These kinds of bold British operations inspired American soldiers and citizens. The thought spread, if the British can do this, so can we. This mutual inspiration among Allied forces played a critical role in winning the war. American and British soldiers fought side by side, and stories like the Kreipe operation showed the world how strong this alliance was. Today, more than 80 years later, this story is still being told. Films are made, books are written, documentaries are filmed. Why? Because this story tells a universal truth. Courage and intelligence can defeat even the greatest powers. Tyranny doesn't last forever, and those who fight for freedom are on the right side of history. In Crete today, you can still see traces of Fermor and the resistance fighters. In mountain villages, elders pass down the stories their grandfathers told them. The British came, they say. They kidnapped the general, and we helped them. This story has become part of Cretan identity. It's passed down through generations, and every time it's told, the spirit of that brave knight comes alive again. Fermor's house in Crete is now a museum. Visitors can see his belongings, his books, his photographs. Maps from that era hang on the walls. The pens he wrote with still sit on his desk, and through the window you can see the magnificent Mediterranean view that Fermor looked at every day. This house is like a sacred place dedicated to the memory of a hero. Now, I want to say something to you. Throughout this video, we've been on an incredible journey together. We saw how a handful of brave people defied the world's most powerful army. We watched how the impossible was made possible, and I hope this story has inspired you too. Because history isn't just events that happened in the past. History is full of lessons that shape our present and our future. People like Fermor and Moss teach us what courage really means. They show us that it's possible to overcome fear, and most importantly, they remind us of the importance of fighting for what we believe is right. They didn't take the easy way out. They didn't choose what was safe. They took on the hardest path, the most dangerous mission, and they succeeded. Do you know why I told this story? Because stories like this should not be forgotten. New generations should know what their grandfathers and grandmothers went through. They should understand that freedom isn't free, and when necessary, they should be ready to show the same courage. They say history repeats itself, but those who know history don't repeat the same mistakes, and those who know history's heroes can become heroes themselves when needed. This is why this channel exists, to bring you the forgotten stories of World War II, its hidden heroes, its incredible operations. In every video, a new adventure, a new hero, a new lesson. If you enjoy this kind of content, you're in the right place. And now, I'll let you in on a secret. The Kreipe operation was incredible, but there are dozens of crazy operations like this from World War II. For example, have you heard of the men who infiltrated Nazi Germany's most secure facility and sabotaged Hitler's secret weapons program? Or the American hero who single-handedly held off hundreds of Nazi soldiers? Or the Australian commandos who waged guerrilla warfare alongside the native people on Pacific Islands under Japanese occupation? You'll find all of these stories on this channel. In upcoming videos, we'll shine a light on the darkest corners of the war. We'll tell the stories of the bravest people on the most impossible missions, and each time we'll discover what history teaches us. Our next video will especially interest you. I'm going to tell you about the operation carried out in Nazi-occupied Norway that shattered Hitler's dream of an atomic bomb, the heavy water sabotage. The story of a handful of Norwegian heroes who changed the fate of the world. If the Kreipe operation excited you, this story will knock you out of your seat. Don't miss it. Thank you for watching this video. Without history enthusiasts like you, there would be no point in telling these stories. But you're here, you're listening, you're keeping the memory of these heroes alive, and that means the world to me. Remember, history doesn't forget its heroes, and neither will we. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments which World War II story you'd like to hear. See you in the next video. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye.